Hi, I'm Sarah.
And I'm Rena, and welcome to
Biopic, a podcast story. This is a podcast about the good, bad, ugly, and absurd of this specific genre of motion picture, the biopic. If you want to learn more about us, our scoring system, and how we choose movies, please check out our special introductory episode, Introduction, Who Are We and What Are We Doing?
Sarah, what movie are we doing this week?
This week, we will be talking about Marie Antoinette, and we are so excited to welcome our third guest star, Belle, who is the host of the podcast Silhouettes, the fashion history podcast. She explores the history of fashion on this podcast. You can download that wherever podcasts are found. And she also has a Patreon page where you should absolutely go and support her show and check her out. She's incredibly knowledgeable about all things fashion, and we're so excited to have her here to talk about this movie. So welcome to the show, Belle.
Thank you for having me.
We always ask our guests, do you have a favorite biopic, or alternately, or you can answer both, a biopic that you wish that they would make?
One of my favorites is probably Marie Antoinette. I would love a biopic about David Bowie. I think that would be a great one.
Yes. There is one. They couldn't get the musical rights, so the actor playing him only sings covers, and it's on a list that we call Biopics of the Damned.
That's why I've not seen it or heard of it then. In terms of both a fascinating life, a fascinating sort of story, a great lead person, and the visuals of it I think would be incredible. And I love a biopic that's sort of 70s, 80s leaning.
Totally the same. Excellent. Rena, can you give us the trigger warning?
Trigger warning. This movie contains depictions of child brides, misogyny, rampant spending, gambling, child death, and very, very big hair.
All accurate. Rena, is there a spoiler warning this week?
Spoiler warning! We are going to spoil everything, including possibly the major plot points in works of narrative art having nothing to do with this particular movie. Consider yourself warned.
Sources used in this episode include... Rena, did you read anything? I read the internet.
I read Antonia Fraser's Marie Antoinette, The Journey. And I've actually 3 times read Susan Nagel's biography of Marie Antoinette's daughter, Marie Therese, Madame Royale. I read the bio of Marie Antoinette's hairdresser, Leonard. It's a life and a century that I've been passionate about since I was a kid. But none of that was necessary because we have Belle, an actual fashion historian, who knows way more about this than either of us.
Talking about sources, I read a really good one, which is called Fashion Victims, The Dangers of Dress Past and Present by Alison Matthews David. And that's not distinctly about Marie Antoinette, but it goes into a lot of her life and her relationship with fashion.
Belle, can you give us, say, a 300-second talk on the life of Marie Antoinette?
She's a really fascinating woman, I think, in history because she's become very mythicized. People have so many ideas about her and there's so many famous quotes by her and people very much know the visuals of her, but actually when you go into who she really was and her real life, the sort of infamy breaks down. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to choose this movie, because it very much shows sort of the life and times of her in a very kind way, I think, compared to a lot of the opinions that people have towards her and the life she lived and who she was. She was very much quite a youthful, naive woman who was living in France as Princess Anne's queen at a very politically, economically tumultuous time, and I think was very much wrapped up in this sort of bubble in the life she lived and the life that was happening outside of the court of Versailles. In that respect, there's a lot of youthful naivety about her as an individual. When you study her and when you look into her more deeply, all these quotes, let them eat cake being the main one, all the sort of horrible things about her and her being this sort of terrible person that spent all their money and did all these horrible things really breaks down.
Rena, I don't know if it's a good time to mention this, but we do have some corpse capers this week.
Yes. So Marie Antoinette, after being guillotined and Louis XVI were thrown into a mass pit that was covered with quicklime to help the bodies dissolve faster. However, after the Bourbon Restoration, they go to the mass cemetery and they claim they recognize Marie Antoinette's jawbone and decaying garter, and that they've found what they believe to be the remains of her and Louis XVI. So they transfer these to a grave in Saint-Denis where you see her dressed in, it really looks more like 1820s clothing than what she actually would have worn, because the cycle where things become attractive again hadn't yet happened. And I think I remember reading that Marie-Thérèse just wanted to let them stay in La Madeleine and not do all of this. So supposedly they are now buried in Saint-Denis. Whether that happened is open to debate.
Right.
So I have a question for you, Belle. One of the things that I've noted in these movies set in the 18th century is I have read that the hair got up to 3 feet high. I feel like you never see full replication unless they want to make someone look absolutely ridiculous, because it just doesn't look good to modern eyes. Is the idea that we have of these 3-foot-tall hairdos that Monsieur Leonard could do, is that what they actually looked like?
It's tricky. It's one of those things in fashion history where probably, but they don't exist anymore. But a lot of these sort of huge wigs that you would have seen would have been used in satire and satirical comics. So they were potentially made more over the top in these magazines to sort of take the mickey out of people, basically. You saw that a lot with the macaronis in the in the 18th century. The British men that would go to Europe on their big European tours would dress very, very over the top and reportedly wear these huge 3-foot wigs, but also satirical comics would be laughing at them. So there's an element of they probably were big, but maybe not quite as big as a lot of the images we see, because a lot of the images are based off dramatizations of sort of ways of taking the mickey. So maybe not quite as big as we see, but they would have generally been huge, particularly for the royals, because it was all about taking up space. If you're the head of the household, you want to be the one that takes up the most space in the room and be the tallest and the biggest. So I think it's sort of half a dozen of one, half a dozen of the other, if that makes sense.
What started you on your fashion journey? I would just be interested to hear how you got here and what gets you most excited right now in fashion, either old or new.
I don't really know where I first started to get into fashion history, but it's just sort of always what I found myself leaning towards since I was really young. The thing I was most interested in, particularly the visuals of it. My parents are very fashionable people, so I think I've always been interested in clothes and how you represent yourself. And I remember, I think it was year 6 at school, so I was 10, 11. We studied like the Second World War, and we really got deep into the Tudors and history. And I just was always wanting to know more about how they were dressing and why they were dressing certain ways. I obviously grew up in the 90s, 2000s, where we had a lot of really amazing period dramas for girls and for kids, Secret Garden, Little Princess, etc. I think there's also an element that I've always loved about fashion history is that it's really the history of people, individual people, in a way that maybe doesn't come across in sort of broader histories, political histories, which it is interesting and is important to understanding, how things change, etc. And I think one of the best ways to do that is through how people dressed and how they displayed themselves, how they wore clothes or used clothes depending on their sort of lived experience. I like going in, with a fashion lens, and then you can kind of, they were dressing like this at this time because this was happening, and it kind of gives you a nice throughway.
Why do you think Marie Antoinette continues to fascinate us?
I think it's just like the fascinating story of she was at the complete top and then at the complete bottom, and I think there's a lot of just the tragedy of it all and the lavishness, sort of the two together is just like, I don't know, quite unique, I suppose.
Sarah, can you please tell us a little bit about the movie Marie Antoinette, directed by Sofia Coppola?
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. So Marie Antoinette, 2006 historical drama written, directed, and produced by Sofia Coppola, and it is based on the aforementioned Marie Antoinette: The Journey. It premiered at the Cannes Film Festival in 2006, competed for but did not win the Palme d'Or. $40 million budget and made about $60 million. It did okay. It had a mixed response at the time, but it has definitely developed more of a cult following and become more understood as time has gone by. The cast is stacked like whoa. Kirsten Dunst plays Marie Antoinette. Jason Schwartzman is in this. Rip Torn, Asia Argento, the wonderful Marianne Faithfull. So many wonderful performances in this movie. We weren't ready for it in 2006, but we're ready for it now.
Some of the casting in this is not what we think of when we think 18th century, but it's more about getting the idea of how these people were seen. Particularly Asia Argento as Madame du Barry looks nothing like Madame du Barry, but does capture, I think, what she seemed like to people.
Yeah.
There's like meta level stuff happening with the casting of this film that is kind of bananas. Like Rip Torn IRL had a secret family that he kept from his wife, Geraldine Page, and is playing the king. Jason Schwartzman essentially seems like Max Fisher Goes to Versailles, like his entire persona.
There's a blink and you'll miss it appearance by baby Tom Hardy.
Yes.
Oh, really?
Yes.
That's so funny. I never noticed.
We open with 14-year-old Antoine waking up, and she really looks 14 here. And one of the things that I did watching this was I went to the end, and it really is a journey because she's so different by the end from what she is at the beginning, which is to be expected in a performance of a woman aging 20 years over the course of a movie.
Yeah, she's really good in this.
I think she was a perfect choice, to be honest, because she kind of gets that like youthfulness, that sort of naivety, maybe a hint of like ignorance in there that I think Marie Antoinette probably did have, but she does it endearingly, which is hard to do. There's not many people that I think could sort of get that balance well, and she looks amazing.
Yes,
she looks beautiful the whole time. Like there's not a moment where she doesn't look incredible. So she's just the perfect, I think, choice for the film.
I guess one of the things that gets down is like Marie Antoinette is not an intellectual at all. She has her dabbling reading one bit from Rousseau much later in the film. She's an ordinary teenager, I think.
Yeah. And she's so young. She's 14 when she gets married and carted away from her home, put into this crazy, the court of Versailles. I can't even imagine, going through that at 14. And also a 14-year-old now, the perspective we have versus a 14-year-old in the 18th century, she would have been probably nowhere but her own house. We don't know very much about her young childhood. I know she was into arts and music, but you just can't imagine the feeling of that. I think it definitely does get left out a lot of the narrative.
This opening where she is being dropped off in the middle of the woods to walk into a tent and become French, and they take her dog away.
That bit's so sad. She gets him back though.
She does. But so yeah, right. Like the way that she is, like the thing that is most devastating to her in that moment is having her dog taken away.
And it would be at that age, that would be such an important part of your life. That would be horrible. That whole intro scene, I think, is really, really well done. She's just like physically and metaphorically stripped, basically, of everything that she was. And I love the moment where she's just stood in the tent. They take off all her Austrian clothes. She stood there naked, and then they throw on these French clothes. And it's just like, who you are is gone. You're this new French woman now. And the way they do that through the clothing is really, really cool from a visual point of view.
Yeah, we see her, she hugs her mother, Marianne Faithfull, goodbye, and Marianne Faithfull tells her the court of France is not like Vienna. And we see that she's like a warm, open, affectionate person. There's that bit where she hugs the Comtesse de Noailles, played by Judy Davis, and it's like, what are you doing? That she has this naturalness to her. And one of the pieces of information I came across in researching this was that Marie Antoinette was woefully uneducated. The French marriage was supposed to go to an older sister of hers who got smallpox, and they couldn't send off a princess with a ruined face. But she was barely educated, and they had to play catch up for a few years.
As I was watching this opening, I'm like, I feel like I've seen this scene in every Sofia Coppola movie where the woman is taken and transformed into a vision of something that she is supposed to be to support a patriarchal gaze.
Yeah, totally.
We just watched Priscilla, and we see this happen with her too.
Oh, I've not seen.
You watch her be transformed from a normal-ish teenager into, this is what you're going to look like to make everybody happy here.
It's almost like a caricature, isn't it? Like you're putting on your uniform, you're dressed how you're supposed to be dressed, but that's not necessarily who they were.
It's gross.
It's also so hard from our modern point of view to see that as normal. I don't think it's ever been particularly normal at any point in history. People have always thought it was pretty gross, but it wasn't maybe quite as bad as we see it today. I think there's a lot of context and perspective. So it is really hard to know how people felt about her being essentially sold off as a child bride at the time. Did people think it was weird? Was it just, this is just how it goes? It's tricky, isn't it?
I mean, it must have just been how it went. It's not like they were in love or anything like that. It was to keep the peace. They must have been like, we trade our kids for that.
Marriage was a business transaction, wasn't it? All throughout history. It was not only really in recent years that it's become something completely different. That's why people had mistresses, because the mistress was the actual relationship and the wife was the business. It's just so bizarre and horrible, but that's just how it went, particularly if you were royal leaning in any way.
I love this movie. It's an incredibly well-crafted movie. Yeah. Roger Ebert had a quote that I think about all the time, which is, it's not what a movie is about, it's how it's about it. And I think this movie is like the platonic ideal of that quote in terms of like it. I know that there's things that smarter people could really go through and be like, this is wrong and this is wrong and this is wrong. But the spirit of what Sofia Coppola is trying to communicate about Marie Antoinette is very real and very alive. I wish more of the movies that we watched were this and had this kind of energy and this kind of intention, and less the Wikipedia and then check marks. And the way that she very intentionally uses music and fashion, she's making a point. And there's a clear vision and a clear like auteur sensibility here that I really love. And I just wish everyone put this much hustle and spirit into their storytelling.
And the movie is about Marie Antoinette. It's not about the French Revolution. So I think that's an important distinction to understand. And we are basically experiencing that time period from her point of view. She would have lived in this extravagant bubble. She knew what was going on, but not to the level that, we know now. I think the fact that we experience the whole time period in that same way, like it's quite a claustrophobic movie in a way, because we barely ever leave the palace. There's only a few moments where we do, and it's not really till the very end that you actually see France and everything that's going on. So I think that's definitely done intentionally, in that we are experiencing this lavish lifestyle along with her.
She really captures like the claustrophobia there too, because you're constantly hearing like the stream of shit talking that's going on about everybody, about her, about her husband, about such and such, Duchess and this person and that person, and like, all of these things that are happening, and like sort of like these things that would preoccupy you. And it's a comment on where we are now in the world, in terms of we let all sorts of random crap get in the way of like actually like understanding what's going on and allowing it to distract us. And the era in which this was made, like 2005, 2006, we were at peak. You know what we need to be paying less attention to? Iraq. But you know what we need to pay more attention to is Paris Hilton. What are they going to do? They're not going to storm the palace, right? We're not going to have to run away in fear. Like, I'm going to go pretend to be poor here in my garden.
Yeah. I'm glad they focused on that in this movie, to be fair. If they left that out, it would have been
the time-honored tradition of pretending to be poor when you're rich.
That was one of the first moments when you sort of go into it that really happened. It's like the glamorization of like the peasant life. That's basically what cottagecore is as a fashion trend, isn't it? It is like it's taking like all these sort of cottagey like farmhouse things, and you wear them to the shop.
Yeah,
you're not wearing it to go like dig and do stuff that farm people do. I don't do that.
Yeah, I'm not milking a cow.
I'm gonna wear a dress, digging, shearing sheep. One of my favorite moments in this movie particularly is when they're cleaning all the eggs before they take them out to make sure they're not dirty and gross before she has to touch them. It's just this total like fabrication of this life. But then also I kind of don't blame her for wanting to do that. That she wanted to recreate her childhood, apparently. That was one of the reasons she did it, because she was so into gardening and nature, and she just had no opportunity to experience that in Versailles. So it's one of those weird things in that she wanted to live that more peasant life, but she used the people's tax money to make it.
Oh, gosh.
It's like, I understand, but you didn't quite do it in the right way, did you?
She arrives at Versailles, and Marie Antoinette's bedroom at Versailles is one of my favorite rooms in the world. I love it. I used it as my background during COVID, not for work. They do such an incredible job of reproducing interiors at Versailles because I guess since everything is like ancient and treasured, you can't stuff gets brutalized on a film set. So a lot of things were rebuilt.
Fair enough. I mean, a lot of it was filmed at Versailles, wasn't it?
They
did. A lot of the ballroom scenes and like corridor scenes. So they do such a good job of integrating the sets versus the real palace.
Yeah, they gave her the rare permission to shoot on location there.
I think it really definitely adds to it. Like just the grandeur and the size and the scale, and like it's just not something you can really recreate in the same way.
No.
You totally get that feeling of just how big everything is and how fancy and shiny.
We also see right away how insane their lives are. Yeah. She and Louis get married very quickly, and she's trying to engage him, and he's a wet blanket.
Yeah. He is a bit
making his locks
in this movie particularly. The way they depict him is really, really interesting. He also looks quite a lot different to how Louis XVI actually looked. Like he was
Louis XVI. Louis XVI didn't look like Jason Schwartzman?
No, he didn't.
Jason Schwartzman did gain 45 pounds for this role.
Did he?
Really?
Oh.
Yeah.
That's a lot. Yeah, he's not tall.
No. He's the only person, his casting I'm sort of 50-50 on. He plays a good part of the role that is written for the film, but in terms of playing a real individual, they don't match up for me. Like when I read about him or see his portraits, I'm like, there's a disconnect here. But I suppose the film isn't trying to be perfect and historically accurate.
He has, we call it an iPhone face, I believe is the technical term. Yeah. There's a modernness to his face. He is like in my brain so ingrained as Max Fisher to me. So it's like very confusing to see him to see him in the wigs and whatnot. But
yeah, I do love that they did actually put them in wigs though. They didn't scrimp on that element of it. And the wigs would have been such a huge part of costume and daily dress. The fact that they sort of honoured that and did a good job visually of representing that, I really appreciate, because definitely some of these 18th century depictions, it's like the wigs, they're just not, they're not quite right. They're either too plain or they use the same one too frequently. She famously changed about 3 or 4 times a day. You can't even imagine the scale of her wardrobe. It would have been absolutely huge. And that's something that they represent well in this movie. I don't think she ever wears the same outfit, maybe more than twice. Certainly there's a lot of clothes that she only wears once. And her wigs are very cool. I love it.
Speaking of changing clothes, we see that there's the order of who's allowed to dress her. We see how many times that has to change hands anytime anyone enters the room because they're where they are on the royal food chain. There's so much sort of standing around and watching her too. Like just all the time, people are just watching her.
Yeah.
It's like it's another reason why the Kirsten Dunst casting is so spot on too, just because she was a child star. So she is someone who gives like a level of ethos to the way that she plays, like being watched all the time, but also this sort of sense of like, this is what I'm used to also. Like somehow Coppola pitch perfectly captures how insane all of this is while also making it feel very normal.
And I think the dressing in this represents that really well. If you're in that sort of royal household lifestyle, the personal moments don't really exist, and particularly when it comes to dressing. I think also the way they sort of show the dressing scenes, everyone having their own role, and she's just sort of standing there placidly, she's not able to really do anything, kind of shows just the lack of control she had in general. It's sort of like a microcosm of that. Just everything's done to her, for her. She's just that she just happens to be a body in the room, really. She doesn't have any sort of autonomy over what's happening to her. I think that was just sort of her life in general a little bit.
So when she goes to court, we meet Louis XV's mistress, Madame du Barry, played by Asia Argento. She looks nothing like Madame du Barry, but she very much captures the idea of how Madame du Barry was seen. She's the only one that you really see wearing like jewel tones around Versailles. And actually, Belle, do you know, was Versailles really this pastel?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really, really what was popular at the time. You look back at portraits and it was just super light colours and light blues and pinks and whites, because those colours were exceptionally hard to get, exceptionally hard to clean, exceptionally hard to wear. So, you know, the lighter the gowns you were wearing, the more money and access you had, because it was so impossible to bleach and keep fabrics pale. It was easier to get darker tones. I think that's interesting because people think about historical fashion and like, well, if you wore purple, then you were royal. And that is true to an element, but also people forget white was also a huge part of royal dress. So I like how often we see the people higher up in the court in this movie are wearing lighter colours, and the sort of lower you go down on the social scale, the darker the clothes they wear. For the most part, it would have been the lighter colours would have been the most popular for the higher you were. And if you look back at portraits of Marie Antoinette and her stylist, basically the woman who designed a lot of her clothes, Rose Bertin, they're in lighter clothes, and she very much liked pastels and blue particularly, and pastel whites.
Although Rose Bertin is really the first designer that we know, and it makes me so sad that so little of her work survives.
I know. We need a film just about her, I feel like. She's not really in this movie, and that makes me sad. That could have been such an interesting element of the film, because they had such a strong relationship. Rose Bertin played a huge role in styling her to be queen. You know, she was like, you're going to be seen, you're going to be painted, I'm going to create looks for you that will sort of give off what you want to give off in terms of power and queenliness. And I think it's sad in this movie that we don't see enough of Rose Bertin and her influence on Marie. But there's only so much they can do in 2 hours.
There's a whole diplomatic thing about she has to acknowledge Madame du Barry, even though she thinks she's a big hoe, and they shouldn't have to interact. And
controversial.
Yeah, and also, like, the cast, as usual, the people who play people in movies are like them 2.0. The Bourbons, at this point, I do not think were a very attractive family if you look at pictures of Louis and his younger brothers. And they cast movie people who are attractive as them and as their relatively unattractive wives. And truthfully, I don't care.
Yeah, her mom's super on her case about a bunch of things. She's like, get pregnant. Why haven't you gotten pregnant yet? And you got to be nicer to this lady. Is it inaccurate to say that they didn't consummate the marriage for almost that long too?
Basically 7 years.
That...
It was, yeah, they had a baby very quickly after they first did. But that's because he was 15. She was 40. He apparently had lots of checkups to check he was all right. Because he was like, yeah, and then they think he just didn't know what to do because he'd never been told, which is, that's kind of sad. You know, he was a little boy.
You'd think, like, the amount of time people spend standing around looking at them, someone would have been like, "Hey, do you know what you're doing?
What are you up to?"
Yeah. I was trying to find this quote from a letter of from that visit that you see where her brother Joseph comes to see them about why aren't you pregnant? I couldn't find it. He sends this letter home, which is a big TMI, where he explains that Louis did not know that he was supposed to discharge inside Marie Antoinette. He would get hard and pull out.
He just didn't know. And then someone finally told him, and he was like, "Oh."
Standing there watching someone just tell him, "Oh my gosh."
Yeah, I wonder, if they weren't allowed? Was it was that too far? Were they just painfully stood there going, "Oh my God, please"? The rules were so different at different time periods. Some time periods I think they were allowed to interject, but maybe this one they weren't. I don't know. Oh, 7 years though.
7 years.
That's a really long time. A couple years, maybe 2, 3. 7 years.
We see that Louis is not at all a sexual person. He likes to play with his locks and go hunting.
Can we talk about his pet elephant?
Yes.
How?
They had menageries at their palaces.
But how where did it come from? How did it get there?
Yeah, I don't actually know anything about this.
There were elephants in zoos. Yeah, I did not look into this, but the elephant's trunk is used as a metaphor to explain to Louis what he is supposed to do in bed. Mm-hmm. And the letter that Marie Antoinette's brother Joseph sent home, if you come across it, is the TMI of it is really funny, where he's like indignant and graphically describes what has been going wrong in bed.
I loved this performance. I love Danny Houston so much. He has such a lovely energy. Rose Byrne enters the chat at this point, and oh my God, is she the cutest person ever?
I love her in this movie. Her. Yeah, she's great. And I love her styling against Marie Antoinette as well. They sort of create a great little double act in terms of hers is like, I think Marie's is definitely, it's lavish, but it's sort of softer.
She is Yolande de Palestron, Duchess of Polignac.
She's definitely a lot more sort of grown up looking, a bit more sexualized. I like the sort of way they interact with each other. And the costuming, I think, is really good. It's subtle and it's there if you really look for it, but it also tells the story of how they interacted with each other.
We're seeing that Marie she's starting to get like a little bit more into her role. She's starting to enjoy it more. Mm-hmm. The shopping ramps up, the fashion ramps up, all of these beautiful shoes come in and out, all of these lingerie pastries and candy and everything. It's all so beautifully executed and it looks kind of fun. It isn't fulfilling in a lot of ways, clearly, but it's also like they're having a really good time.
The I Want Candy scene is so good when they're filling the champagne tower. I'm like, yes, I want to live this life. But also, I think we have to think of the context of she was probably really sad and lonely, and her husband was basically like ignoring her at this point. She had all these people telling her like a queen is supposed to spend money, she's supposed to dress lavishly. So she was like, fine, I'll fill my time with all these crazy things that you're telling me to. And I think the way they go through that in the movie is great because a switch flips almost, and she's just like, cool, I'm gonna live the life of what you want me to live.
There's a scene where they go to a ball in Paris incognito, and this is the lobby of the Opera Garnier in Paris, which was not there at the time, but the mishmash of styles that it has, and it captures the opulence of the time, I think, and you hear Hong Kong Garden in the background. And this is Sofia Coppola in not keeping it in the world of let's have everything be absolutely period accurate. It's to capture the spirit of these are teenagers being lavish. And she flirts with Axel Fersen, who we'll see again. Louis has an embarrassing conversation with a man about what is up with his wife. They come back to Versailles, and somewhere around here, Rip Torn dies. And This is actually something he said. Lord have mercy on us, for we are too young to rule, said Louis XVI.
Yeah, I loved how they went right into her 18th birthday party after this too. I thought like this once again, so brilliant, like playing the New Order music.
Mm-hmm.
It felt like it captured like the vibe of being 18, 19 years old and staying up all night and having deep conversations with your friends while you're watching the sunrise. Like, I thought this was such a beautifully executed sequence. And loved it so much. And it just like, it felt like this is what this movie was trying to tell us. And I felt like
teenagers
that
are
came
teenagers.
through yeah, like it came through so strongly and with just like such a loving sentimentality to like just being 18.
Kind of merging of maybe more modern feelings and putting it through a historical lens, I think, is done really well in this film. And yeah, that scene is definitely one of those you're like, I can understand that. You know, we've all been there. That's a life experience probably a lot of people have had. You definitely feel a bit closer to her in that moment, I think.
Yeah. And she's gambling and partying and then
and it reminds you how young she is. This is her 18th birthday. She'd been here for 4 years at this point, or 3 or 4 years. She was still so entrenched in that world, but still so young. So it just is that perfect sort of realization of like what her life might have been like.
And this is followed by the sequence where she's hanging out in her new country house. And again, like things that have never changed is sitting around listening to a couple of like faux deep guys play the guitar. I was like, oh, I've been here. This is very relatable. Is these two dudes. Yes.
I know you guys.
Louis gifts her Petit Trianon, which is, so Versailles was too formal, so Louis XIV builds Trianon, which is to get away from Versailles. It's about walking distance. Petit Trianon is like a getaway within a getaway. She also builds her little peasant village around there.
She does finally get pregnant.
Unfortunately, she has a girl.
Boo. Although there is that lovely scene where she says something like, if you're a boy, you would be the child of France, but because you're a girl, you're mine, or something like that. And it's really sweet. It must have been so scary.
She seems like she's a very engaged and loving mother for a queen. Is that the case based on history?
She really did love her children. And she actually had 3 children. And in this film, they only show you 2, so it's all a bit confusing.
She had 4 children, but one of them was a little princess who died in infancy.
Yeah.
So they cut the number of children. She had Marie-Thérèse, then she had the first Dauphin, and then she had his younger brother. The first Dauphin is a nightmare of inbred health problems, although Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were not that closely related by the standards.
But they missed him a little bit.
Yeah, there were a bunch of cousin-ages in the family tree.
Marie-Thérèse married her cousin, right?
Yeah, she did. Her first cousin, I'm pretty sure, which is not so good. Not great. Obviously, she couldn't be as involved as maybe she wanted to, but that was one of the reasons she wanted the chateau built, so then she could spend more time with her children, and that was one of the ways she sort of really did have a lot of time with them in a way that maybe she wouldn't have been able to have before. And she's painted quite a great deal with her children. There's moments of that in the film as well, but she is often painted with her children because she wanted to be remembered as being a mother.
Louis agrees to fund the American War for Independence, to stick it to the English, despite warnings around the treasury being depleted, which get worse and worse over the course of the film. Louis would be a fantastic constitutional monarch because his intelligence is so average, but he's so invested in formality. He is the last person who would have any interest in Absolute Monarchy. They're both people of relatively average intellect. I don't know if I sound like a pretentious person saying that, but it also captures that they're people who've just been thrown into this by virtue of birth. We previously met Count Fersen in the Hong Kong Garden Ball scene, but he comes back and he realizes the enchanting creature that he spoke to was Marie Antoinette.
Is that the masked ball scene?
Yes, where
She doesn't look like herself either. She's sort of this like other version of herself because she's outside of the palace. She's in a black gown, the black sort of bit of lace over her eyes. Is that, am I thinking of the right scene? She's like allowed to sort of be this more, I don't know, dark, like commanding presence than she is in the rest of the movie, where she's very much in like pastels and like colours. You can see how he would maybe not know it was her, and I think that's a really smart way of having their sort of meet cute happen. I just use the phrase meet cute very casually there.
No, it is a meet cute. It is for sure a meet cute, and then it is a re-meet cute, and
yes,
they are into each other like whoa. And he was that is Jamie Dornan. So yes, they're horsing around and having an affair, and against the backdrop of all of this, like, things are snowballing. The let them eat cake comment happens.
I love the way they do that scene.
Oh,
it's so good. I'm going to look at this from a costuming point of view. She's got, the dark lipstick and the sort of really thick jewels. She's much darker styled, and I'm like, that's not Marie. That's not Marie Antoinette that we know through the rest of the film. So it's kind of showing that she didn't actually say it. It's not her. It's this sort of version that the French people have created of her. So from a visual point of view, like, she doesn't look like herself because it isn't her that says it. I think I really love the way they did that. It's so small and subtle, but very smart.
She's like, I'm just gonna ignore this. It's gossip, and I'm like, no, don't
do it. People will know you for
don't
that.
Ignore it. Don't.
Yeah. I'm so curious about that phrase in general. And where it came from, and if she did say a version of it, if she was overheard saying something like it, or if it's a complete fabrication.
It's never made a ton of sense to me.
What that came from, like, one of the pieces of information is that it was some other aristocratic lady who said it, and she meant like the crusts of pâté.
I did hear that,
which actually sounds even worse than let them eat cake as we think of cake, and it got misattributed to Marie Antoinette. And there were all of these scurrilous pamphlets being distributed that appealed to the lowest common denominator. Many people who got into the revolution, they weren't reading Thomas Paine. They were reading things with drawings of Marie Antoinette hooking up with her ladies in waiting.
They were reading the Daily Mail equivalent, basically, weren't they? Like all the jokes and satirical comments and horrible comments about her that actually they probably didn't really know anything about what was happening. Wasn't her nickname Madame Deficit? That's how she was known in the comics, because she was spending all their money and they hated her for it, basically.
You know what's interesting too is the Marriage of Figaro is considered a piece of like propaganda from the time period, because its depiction of the ruling class apparently incentivized the revolutionary spirit in France. So there's
this scene of her performing in like a shepherdess outfit where I just felt embarrassed for her.
Yeah, that scene's a bit hard to watch, isn't it?
God.
Don't make people listen to you sing.
She was just naive and young and wanted to have fun and perform, but didn't quite realise that was not something that would have presented her well.
That also made me incredibly happy, because I was like, this is the Max Fisherist thing that's going to happen in this movie, is like him being like, I'm putting on this massive play here in my wife's pretend house where she's playing a milkmaid.
It's all just so pretend, isn't it? Like, so much of what she did just was quite shallow, really. She didn't really have any proper sort of experiences as per, this movie represents that well, but everything was just so performative.
Yeah. I don't know if anyone on this call has ever had the delight of having to watch someone's passion project sitting next to them. I felt that pain watching this. as they're all like, and I'm like, oh, you're like, yay, I have to clap or I'm going to lose my job.
Oh God, yeah. And she's probably like, I'm amazing. They loved it. Speaking of the operas though, there is the great scene where she's clapping at the beginning of the film and everyone's like clapping with her and they're like, yay. Later she does the same thing again and everyone just like stares down at her and she realizes nobody likes me anymore.
I loved that. I thought that was so effective.
And the styling in that is really good too, to show the passage of time, because this film is really good at doing the like really subtle changes in clothes that happen between like the early 1770s where she's just introduced into the court and later on towards the end of her life. And one of the ways I noticed in this scene particularly is the hair. The beginning of the 1770s, it was taller and thinner, and then it got sort of lower and flatter. And if you compare how she looks at this point later in her life, it's like low and wide as opposed to thin and tall. And I was like, that's a good, very subtle thing that if you know, you notice it. And that was one of the scenes I noticed it. And she just looks so different and her styling is very different to how she's at the beginning. And it kind of presents this like, she's a different person and people are viewing her differently, but also historically accurate. So there you go.
At this point too, they were like, okay, you guys got to get out of here. And she's like, no, I'm going to stay with my husband, which I thought was like, first of all, that's not, and that's why I'm not going to be in a royal family, is because I'm like, that wouldn't be my choice. I'd be like, bye. This was an arrangement in the first place. I'm going to go. Yeah. I'm going to take some of this candy and my shoes. And I'm going someplace where people aren't going to murder me. But she did, much to her credit, stay with her family.
Whether that was in like ignorance or steadfastness, it's kind of hard to know. Maybe she just didn't have any idea like what was going to happen. But she can't have done.
It shows how disconnected they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's just like, there's no way people are going to like to storm us. It just can't happen. It's like, ooh.
Yeah, there is like also that magical thinking of, yeah, like she's like, well, what are they going to do?
Yeah.
People are pissed off. They'll be mollified at some point. Mm. You don't expect people to storm down the doors and cut off your best friend's head and parade it around outside of your cell. But here we are.
Here we are. Yeah, but that just shows she's lived in such a bubble in Versailles, and she probably did her whole life. And again, this movie does a really good job of showing that she's just like, oh no, like I've been so safe my whole life. She just doesn't have any understanding of what could happen, I guess.
It was an interesting echo of the opening, the way too, where she was saying goodbye to everyone, the way she had hugged all of her girlfriends at the beginning, and watching her say goodbye to each of these people. And it almost felt like she knew things were about to change real bad, but at the same time she didn't want to allow that, because then they go into that dinner sequence where they're sitting there and the noise is coming from outside, and she's laying in bed, and the noise of these people who are furious and like trying to maintain all of that ritual.
It's quite a shocking scene, really, isn't it, in its own way?
Yeah.
I feel like at this point I'm especially aware of how much she's changed since the beginning, where she starts off as this naive, warm, affectionate young girl, and then she gets a bit brittle from the ritual, and she becomes like devil may care, and then she becomes a mother, and at this point we see these gestures from her that are actually very queenly, like when she puts her head on the railing in supplication, or when she says, I'll stay beside my husband, even though, no, you should have decamped to somewhere fortified, preferably near the border, about a year earlier.
Yeah.
But it's at this point that I realize how much she's changed over the course of the movie.
That sort of sense of her just aging, basically, and having all these different phases in her life, to the point where she's just a bit more hardened to it all, I suppose, than maybe a bit more like naive and youthful than she is at the beginning.
And they leave.
And it's sad, and
it's heartbreaking. It's a really weird thing to feel heartbroken for shallow rich people, but at the same time I've left the movie with a lot more sympathy for her.
Yeah.
It happens to me every damn time. Somehow, Marie Antoinette always gets me on her wavelength where I feel sad that she and her ladies can't have this beautiful life anymore, and I don't care about the starving people.
They're just sort of the baddies almost in the movie at this point. It's an interesting flip, like they're the people causing them to have this horrible experience. It's a really interesting perspective change.
I mean, when you do read about the things that they did, it's a little aggressive.
People desperate.
It is.
Right? Yeah, it must have been scary from both points of view, for different reasons. It's a really conflicting like time period, isn't it? In that way,
they did a lot. There was a lot of corpse abuse that I was like, oh, you know what? I get wanting to create a more fair and equitable society. However, must we? But
people also,
I guess we must.
France was doing really badly before Marie Antoinette was even in the scene. Like, they spent all their money on the American Revolution. It was already doing so badly. It wouldn't have mattered who it was. It would have been a bad situation regardless.
We call them the French and Indian Wars over here.
Yeah, I think it's the 7 Years' War is what we would call it.
The two prior Louis had already been draining the treasury on wars and things.
That does slightly get left out of the sort of general narrative of the French Revolution. It's like Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI came in. They spent all the French people's money. They were starving, and then the revolution happened. The end. There's so much context that happens before that, and so many other things that were so out of their control that they had no part in, and they were already coming in to like quite a failing system, you know. And France at the time apparently didn't have like a standardized bank system. The economics of the time were just all over the place.
The only Bourbon who has a clue about leadership regarding the people was Henri IV, who'd been dead for a really long time.
She was kind of damned if she did, damned if she didn't, wasn't she? She couldn't have won, I don't think. No matter what happened, the French people would have been struggling, really.
Well, also being more visible to people because of how she holed herself away. But there is no reason for any of them to have had this hindsight. In retrospective, the royal family sequestering themselves at Versailles for a century separates them from the people, but that was how Louis XIV kept the peace, because he thought, if I can just corral all of the aristocracy here and get them caught up in these stupid little rituals where they're competing for my attention, then they won't go launching regional wars. So it's something where in its conception, it worked to keep the peace, or not when it came to having wars with foreign countries, but it worked to keep the internal peace. And then over the time, it, again, an idea that carries in its birth the seeds of its own destruction.
Yeah, basically.
I mean, it's not a bad idea for some governments. If we could just keep everyone in one place and keep them focused on facile bullshit rather than letting them actually do any lawing, like, it's not a bad idea. Keep them fighting on Twitter about whatever the hell they're fighting on Twitter about right now. Like, whatever they're fighting about today, keep them doing that for like 4 years so the adults can actually get shit done. It's not a bad idea. I see why it failed here.
I think part of why the French feel so disconnected from their aristocracy is because whoever was lord of the manor whose fields they were working, he and his family have been off at Versailles. So yeah, I feel like I don't want to leave this world.
No, it's
beautiful.
It's devastating, and I have feelings about the Virgin Suicides. I don't love that movie. But I do feel like everything that Sofia Coppola has done subsequently, she sticks the landing like crazy when it comes to ending a movie.
Yeah.
We saw it with Priscilla too. Like, she closes with a hard static shot of something that closes the door on an interaction or on a set of events. And she did that here really, really well. And it's devastating to see that room destroyed.
That ending shot is horrible. For both points of view, because you know that everyone in that situation is just suffering. Like the French people and she. It's so somber, isn't it?
you know things are going to be bad for a lot of people for a really long time.
Yeah.
And that room symbolizes that, and it's heartbreaking.
It's such a great image. It really is for the story they're trying to tell.
Especially since that is possibly my favorite room in the world, seeing it wrecked like that.
Like, no. It's a
No.
horror movie.
She didn't even have to share that bedroom. I mean, my God, what a life.
She was there for
Right.
like 19 years. She was there for a long time living that life. It sort of gets forgotten that it wasn't just like 2 years. She'd been there longer than she'd ever been in her hometown, you know, her home life.
And when we see them driven off, I agree with Sofia Coppola's choice to end the story at this point, because I feel like it would make it an hour longer and we would get so numb from pain. It's more pain. It works so well that you just see this beautiful pastel dream world slammed shut with,
Yeah.
"Are you admiring your Lime Avenue?"
Mm.
"No, I'm saying goodbye."
Yeah. Sofia Coppola doesn't seem like someone who wants to do like a movie about prison scenes.
Yeah.
So,
It
or
just
show
gets
trials.
symbolic of her life. That life is ended. She's essentially dead already at that point because who she was is gone. We don't
Yeah.
need to see the other part of her, or horrible part of the rest of her life, because who she thinks she was or who she was living as is over. I like the sort of starkness of it. It was well done, if a bit depressing.
A magical journey, though.
Mm.
Like,
Yeah, it's just all good
so
stuff.
well executed.
Sarah, do we have any awards talk this week?
We do have a little bit of a words talk. I mentioned that this movie was it premiered at the Cannes Film Festival and it competed for the Palme d'Or. It did not win. It was kind of snubbed by a lot of awards. It was I want to be clear, though, it was a really strong year for filmmaking. This did win Best Costume Design, as it should have.
It did. Yeah. Just for the shoes alone.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, I don't care and normally I'm the biggest stickler for accuracy. I don't care if the Blahniks that she's wearing are not exactly what the court shoes looked like, because that line of the Blahnik that everyone goes ooh and ah over captures how Rose Bertin's work would have been seen.
They did such a good job of blending really historically accurate stuff, you know, Robe à la Française and Anglaise and stuff like that, but making them this own new version with like cool funky patterns and prints and styles. So it's like, I really love the mishmash that they managed to do. It's very Bridgerton feeling. We're going to have the core, we're going to have the historically accurate elements, and then we're just going to have some fun with it. And that's what film is all about, isn't it? It's like, it gives you a hint into this world.
I don't think this was an Oscar-batory performance. Rena, I don't know if you agree, but
I don't think it was Oscar-batory. So we have a phrase that we coined, Belle. The term we invented was Oscarbation, for when an actor gives a scenery-chomping performance cynically designed to earn them an Oscar nomination. It does not count as Oscarbatory if they are actually nominated, but we also have the rhyme, no nomination, it's Oscarbation.
Yeah. But I don't feel like Sofia Coppola writes Oscar-batory performances, which is a treasure in itself. Like, there's no like shouty moments, there's no broken furniture, there's no like monologuing in her movies. There's a lot of stillness and everything, and they're not like flashy performances, which I love. And I do feel like Kirsten Dunst was unfairly denied an Academy Award nomination for this movie. I feel like it was overlooked.
I think she
in
was
a lot of
great
ways
in this movie. Yeah, as I said at the beginning of this, the way she balances the different elements of who she would have been is like masterful.
She's very winsome in this. I love that there's not like an attempt for everyone to have the same accent. Like, that is just pushed aside to tell the story. But I do feel like she was denied that.
I think
in this. That year, though, was, just to contextualize this, that was an insane year of filmmaking. So Best Picture went to The Departed.
Yeah, big movie.
And to Martin Scorsese, who I will sometimes call my Lord and Savior on this show. Other movies that came out that year that were really super notable: Last King of Scotland, Half Nelson was Ryan Gosling's real like breakout moment. Helen Mirren one for the Queen. Other movies that came out that year, like The Devil Wears Prada, Notes on a Scandal, Little Children, Dreamgirls, Babel. It was a bananas year for filmmaking.
Yeah.
It was Jarhead came out around the same time. And Kirsten and Jake were dating at the time. And I was like, oh, how sad for both of them to see their movies underperform. How will they get through this as a couple? Everyone endured. It's fine. Everyone's cool. If this movie were to come out today, Kirsten Dunst would get all the prizes for it. I think this movie is just way out in front of itself.
If it came out today, it would do so well.
Bridgerton doesn't exist without this.
That feeling of like sort of ahistoricalness being part of the story and the storytelling and the design of it being a little bit fantastical almost. It doesn't feel like a political movie, even though it should.
Dialogue? Oh, also I should mention before we go on, her dog Mops, the dog playing Mops, won an award at the Cannes Film Festival that is called the Palm Dog Award, which goes to dogs in movies, animated and otherwise. Previous recipients have included the Black Poodle featured in Inglourious Basterds, Doug from the movie Up, the dog Messi as Snoop from Anatomy of a Fall.
That is the best acting dog I've ever seen in my life.
Well, this is a funny award. I do think like it's adorable. And the dog was it did evoke feelings in me.
I have a pitch for you.
Yes.
The dog from Anatomy of a Fall doing an art house remake of Air Bud.
Yes. It's all like impressionistic.
Yeah.
Maybe we get some like Godard touches in there where it's just the dog like barking words back and forth at each other. Jean-Paul Belmondo shows. I'm here for it. Let's do it. That dog is a better actor than Robert Wall.
I'm glad everyone else appreciates just how good of an actor that dog is. Because
the dog was so devastating.
Anyone who hasn't seen that film, they're like, "What are you talking about? It's just a dog." And I'm like, "You don't understand."
Okay, sorry, Rena. Choice dialogue.
That scene is so sad when it just gets ripped from her hands. You're like, no. But she gets him back, doesn't she? She's in bed with him.
She does, yeah.
I didn't actually look into if he was real. I need to look up if he's a real dog.
Do either of you have any lines of dialogue that you noted as particularly quotable?
There's the scene where they're like, oh, you spent like 50,000, not pounds, you spent 50,000 pounds this month, or whatever. It's like half your over budget. And she's like, oh. I can't quote it exactly, but, you know, they're telling her how much money she spent. She's like, oh, okay, sorry, I don't understand that. So whatever that direct quote is, that was a good one.
It's not a quote per se, but the sequence in which she's trying to make conversation with Louis. I hear you make keys as a hobby. He's like, yes. She says, and do you enjoy making keys? Obviously.
That one is good.
I loved that so much. There was nothing like one-liners that stood out, but there were some great exchanges.
There's no big, loud, sort of quotable moments. You sort of have to look for them a bit more, I think. But that's what makes it good, I think.
Yeah.
So, with that out of the way, do you guys want to rate this thing?
So, just to give you the background on how we rate our movies, they are on a scale of 1 to 10 across 10 areas that we find to be subjectively and or objectively important to most films, but specially tailored to the issues particular to biopics. And if you want more details on how we score movies, please scroll down our webpage at Biopic, a podcast story at podbean.com. You'll also find a record of our scores for past episodes. And with that out of the way, let's score this thing.
I'll go first. So for outward appearances, hair and makeup, normally this is supposed to be for whether people look like who they're portraying. But just the level of powder in this, it gets a 10 for effort. And I feel like I've been way too generous lately. For acting and casting, I gave it a 9. For passage of time, I gave it a 5. For costuming, I gave it a 10. For quality of the script, 7.5. For accuracy, 3.5. For storytelling, was it cliched? Was it interesting? Was it inventive? I gave a 7.5. For production value, I gave it a 10. For production direction decision making, I gave it an 8.5. And for do we care, 8.5.
Okay. So outward appearances, I give it a 10. Acting and casting, 9. Passage of time, 7. Costuming, 10. Quality of the script, 8. Accuracy, 5. Storytelling, 10. Production value, 10. Production, direction, decision making, 9. And then Do We Care? Give it an 8.
Yeah, outward appearances, I'd give it a 9. Acting, casting, I think a 9 as well. Passage of time, I'd give that a 7 just because I was a little bit, I don't know, confused about. They didn't kind of make it clear. I'm someone that likes to know the dates. It's just like, everyone always gets annoyed. I'm like, what year is it now? Where are I? But I'd give that one a 7. 4, costuming, 10. 5, quality of the script. I think I'd give that an 8. Accuracy, probably a 7. A storytelling, 8. Production value, production, direction, decision making, probably a 9. And Do We Care? Probably an 8.
So my tally came to 7.95.
Mine came to an 8.6.
I don't know what mine came to, but I think about an 8, something like that. I didn't tally it all up. I just wrote down the numbers I've realised.
That's okay. So is there anything that we want to discuss in quibbling with each other's scores?
No, I don't think so. I think my lowest is Passage of Time, but yeah.
They didn't give me a ton of help on the timing, but I do feel like the performances help to make up for that. But to your point, Belle, not a ton of detail about where or when we were at any given moment.
I would only have known that nearly 20 years had passed because I looked it up. That didn't come across particularly in the film, other than maybe like a few grey hairs on the men at the end.
And I guess I'm always pretty brutal about accuracy,
which is
I think
good.
This film is one you kind of have to just sweep that aside a little bit. It's so tricky, isn't it? Because usually I'm like, no, it has to be accurate, but this one it's like, it's kind of not what it's trying to do, but it is. It's a complicated one here. Like, is a bit more, sort of some leniency.
I was like having
just
all right.
I'll just say it came to like a 7.5. I think that's probably about how it came to on average. I forgot to write it down. It's the evening here, so my brain is now out of action in terms of maths.
So for the tallies, we have Belle 7.5, Sarah 8.6, Rena 7.95, and I did not see this coming. Marie Antoinette, rounded, your score came to 8.01, so you qualified for second opinion.
To give a brief primer on that particular topic, second opinion, we stole this blatantly from the podcast, How Did This Get Made? The prize for scoring above an 8 or below a 4 is that you get to hear us make fun of IMDb reviewers who strongly disagreed with our assessment of the film.
So I have a 1-star review for you. This one, 1 star out of 10, entitled Yankee Idiots, was written by Rahul Ku on November 30th of 2007. Yankee Idiots. First 25 minutes. Nothing happens. Can she speak French before coming to France? We don't know. What kind of personality does she have? We don't know. Film says nothing about the history. Film says nothing about reality. French people have Yankee mimics and dialect. What kind of comedy is this? Film is English. Why? Novel is about France, not USA. Terrible Kirsten, awful acting. This is a real kitsch film. How did they give the prizes? God knows. How did they take the prizes? This is absurd. These are real Yankee idiots. Wow, I feel like this was just written for us. And I'm intrigued by where they say in here, novel is about France, but it's not based on a novel. It's primarily drawn from the Antonia Fraser biography. Sarah, Belle, what do you think of this person and their opinions?
Why are they angry at me?
Yeah, they're a bit confused, I think, about what they're actually reviewing. They don't speak French, but would you prefer to watch the whole film in French? Would you know what was going on? That person maybe would. I don't know. That's a confusing one for me. I don't know.
Nothing happened. I mean, plenty of things happened. Maybe it wasn't interesting to you, reviewer, but
And did they think that Marie Antoinette wasn't a real person, that it was all based off a novel?
Oh no.
Is that the way they're leaning into it?
That's another really good question here. Is this person under the impression that this is fiction?
Yeah.
In which case nothing they just said mattered. It could have happened that way. We don't know. We weren't there.
I don't know. Confusing.
Adam Ant could have been playing on the soundtrack.
We don't know.
How are we to know?
Yeah, we really have an embarrassment of riches this week in terms of 1-star reviews. There's no way of getting to all of these, but just as a sample of some of the titles, complete waste of everyone's time. SC has no talent and this film is horrible. Worst soundtrack in modern history, waste of time and space. What a beautiful waste of time and effort. Sofia Coppola is incompetent. Ugh, then ugh.
Okay.
I could not believe how bad a movie could be. Oh, if Marie had seen this travesty, she would have chopped Sophia's head off.
Okay.
Oh, the worst movie ever made. Little Miss Muffet as Queen Marie Antoinette. But the one that stands out to me here is 1 star, written by Giuseppe Carlos on July 6th of 2006. Another smug effort by America's Daughter of... Title just cuts off there. Rumors came back from Japan during Lost in Translation that Sophia had no clue what she was doing. Many actors on set were frustrated and feeling sick to their stomachs. Bill Murray improves every line in the film, and Sophia walks home with an Oscar as Best Writer. Now she believes in herself so much that out comes this smug effort of self-indulgence. In this one, Dunst is, as always, nothing special, and Jason Schwartzman, another son of, should focus on his diet and stay out of films, even with the giant budget that allowed her to hire top folks in their field, again, to make the film for her. This film is still too long, too dull, poorly acted, and worst of all, smugged. Boo boo to Sophia, boo to the Oscars, and boo to you if you go see this.
Do you think Spike Jonze wrote that?
Why?
He's her ex-husband. There's a lot of personal attacks.
A lot of Sophia.
Is this part of your divorce agreement? Like, what is happening?
Yeah.
Like, all of this, like, tea from the set of Lost in Translation, where I can assure you the biggest problem on that set was Bill Murray. I'm sure of it, because he didn't even know if he was going to show up until he did, because that's how he rolls. I've grown tired of... I'm going to get on my soapbox for a sec here. I've grown tired of like calling women whose products we don't like talentless. It's really reductive and lazy to say that because you don't like someone's vision that they're stupid or they don't have talent. This is her third motion picture that was brought into completion and had a cohesiveness to it that allowed it to be released to the public. Maybe that's not your cup of tea, but she finished a thing. She finished 3 of them.
It's really interesting. Like, just say, this wasn't for me. Personally, it wasn't my thing. I didn't like it. The end. Like, why do you have to get into the like personal attacks? Just say you didn't like it. Move on. You don't have to like everything.
There's plenty of people whose talent is questionable, but you can't say that she didn't deliver like a super cohesive vision that was very much hers. From start to finish.
She knew what she wanted.
It had a point of view. It's a finished product and it makes sense. Sorry, it's not for you, sir. But that doesn't mean that she is without talent.
Like 2 things that are mutually exclusive. Yeah, exactly. Like,
yeah.
Sarah, you had one more, and then I think that'll be it for Second Opinion.
1 out of 10 by Lee Faust, September 16th, 2007. What a waste. Only eye candy, and limited at that. Such a waste. The whole of the Chateau of Versailles as a backdrop for this film. Great period costumes, and then slow, boring, inappropriate music trying to place Marie Antoinette in the 21st century. It starts off well, showing the difficulties of 18th century life in the court of Versailles. But then it tries to Americanize the experience of the young Marie Antoinette as though living in Hollywood in the Paris Hilton age. Total disgust. The plot slows down to show the ennui of palace life and probably distorts it as well. The few accurate historic lines, recorded and repeated often in French history classes, just barely rectify the situation. Kirsten Dunst is, of course, beautiful and may be appropriate for the role, but the script and music and length lose everything.
I think this reviewer entirely missed the point.
There is a lot of that in these reviews of missing the point.
Going in maybe expecting a different movie, I think, is a big part of it. They thought they were going to get this, and then they got this, so they're like, that makes it bad. And you're like, no, it just maybe wasn't what you wanted.
Marketing of this movie made it pretty clear what she was doing. Like, there were Converse All-Stars in the trailer, you know?
People just don't like things and they're very loud about it.
It at no point hid Merchant and Ivory sensibilities and like Trojan horsed in this vision with Adam Ant music.
Yeah.
Like in The Cure.
Yeah.
Like,
what?
It's like, hi, I tricked you into thinking that you were going to see a straightforward period piece.
But no.
No.
Gonna make you angry.
So, Sarah and
Yes.
Belle, is there any other stuff that you would recommend that our listeners watch or read instead, or just this?
Just this, and also, you know, go hit up the soundtrack on the internet. It's really good.
There is also,
Yeah.
I think it's from 2022, they did a really good Marie Antoinette TV show. I don't know if it's available outside of the UK. I don't know that, but that was an interesting, different interpretation. Also, this is going to be a niche one, but do you remember the Nancy Drew PC games from the 2000s?
Yes.
There was one where the whole crux of Marie Antoinette's portraits and jewels were like a big part of the story, and that was one of the first things I remember engaging with Marie Antoinette. What was the game called? I can't remember. Treasure in the Royal Tower, something like that. Niche one, but connected.
I would say, yeah, watch this. It is one of the most visually gorgeous, costume-oriented films ever made.
Totally.
And if you are someone who loves getting lost in another time and space, regardless of the anachronism, this will completely take you onto its wavelength, and you'll be as sad as Louis and Marie to leave Versailles.
Mm-hmm.
If that is all in your wheelhouse. I would also say, I really love Susan Nagel's biography of poor little Madame Royale, and she actually wrote a memoir, which is a tearjerker, where she describes seeing her parents go off to the guillotine and not knowing for ages whether her mother was dead. And the same thing happens with her aunt. And hearing her little brother getting sick and dying and being brutalized through the wall a few rooms down. And she's not a professional writer, so it's all like very simple.
Should I close this out?
Oh, we have plugs. Belle.
Yes, we do.
Can you please tell our listeners all about why your podcast's Silhouettes, a Fashion History podcast, is awesome and entertaining and informative? And let us know if you have any big things coming up that we should be aware of and when. So, plug time, take it away.
Okay. Well, the podcast, I think what I'm trying to do with it is make fashion history nice and accessible for people. You don't have to know how to make clothes. You don't know how the details of how garments are constructed, all those sort of really deep things that you often get with fashion history. It's a very nice introduction to fashion history, and I go into some niche topics and wider topics. I really love sort of delving into the deep things, but in an accessible way. That's always what I'm trying to do with it. So people can know nothing about it and come in and still leave feeling, you know, like they've learned something and they understand what I'm doing, basically. But I'm also interested in how fashion history sort of represents wider histories, political history, economic history. So it's not just about the clothes themselves, it's about how they fit into the time periods and the places and the spaces and the people and all that kind of good stuff. I have some series on there. I have a short history series which traces the origins of individual things in fashion history all the way to how we are today. One of them I did was high heels, which was really interesting. So that's a good series to get started on. If I'm plugging what I'm doing next, I actually have an episode which connects nicely to this one, which is the history of the cottagecore movement. And yeah, it was really interesting to research and sort of how far back it goes. And when we first saw this sort of idea of people taking cottagey lifestyles and fashion and making it a trend. And obviously I talk about Marie Antoinette in that episode, and they'll probably come out around the same time. I'm hoping that will come out in mid-January, so we're at a perfect time now where you can have like a little double bill going on. So yeah, that's my next one that's coming out. That will be interesting, I think.
Awesome.
Fantastic.
I cannot wait to hear that.
Okay.
Great.
Sarah, can you take us out?
Of course, I'd love to. If you like the show, please leave us a 5-star rating and subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And tell a friend, or better yet, plural friends, and share us on social media. We hear it helps. You can follow us on Threads, Blue Sky, and Instagram, where we have visual aids from our episodes. Our Instagram handle is at Biopic a Podcast Story, and our Blue Sky is at biopic-podcast.bluesky.social. So do check us out at both places, and we'll link to all of that in our show notes as well. And please check out our webpage at biopicapodcaststory.podbean.com to see the official episode ratings for all of the movies that we've done so far. And if you'd like to get in touch, you can email us at biopiclistenermailbag@gmail.com.
Tune in next week when we'll be talking about Trumbo in honor of Sarah's birthday. What does our beloved blacklisted Hollywood screenwriter Dalton Trumbo have to do with Sarah's birthday? Not much, except that Trumbo stars two of Sarah's favorite boyfriends, Bryan Cranston and Michael Stuhlbarg.
Mm-hmm. I can't wait to watch Trumbo. Talk about my boyfriends.
Thank you so much for being so generous with your time.
Yeah, Belle, you are amazing. Thank you for coming